When did Moses cross the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea? When did Moses cross the Reed Sea? The date of the Exodus is one of the most hotly debated topics in the book of Exodus. And when we go through this on a college level course, you should be aware that there is a huge debate over the early date and the late date of the Exodus. I'm going to run through the arguments, and then we'll make an analysis of this, okay? So there's going to be this big debate over when did Moses leave Egypt. So first of all, I want to give you the early date. The early date, most people date around 1445, 1440, is called the early date theory. Okay, the early date. Where do they get the early date from? Well, they get it from the Bible. In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it says this, and you should be able to figure this out. It says, 480 years before Solomon's fourth year, Moses came out of Egypt. 480 years before Solomon's fourth year, the Israelites came out of Egypt. Now, you don't know Solomon's date, but whose date do you know? David's 1,000. Is Solomon before or after David? Solomon was David's son. So therefore, when it's a son, they usually come after. Okay? So, now, all right, so we've got David's 1,000. So now we're down to about, what, 9 into the 960s or something? If you take the 480 and you add that to the 960, you end up with this 445 date. Okay? Do you see where they get that? If David's 1,000, Solomon's right after that, about 30, 40 years after that, and you take the 480 years, it says 480 years before Solomon's fourth year, then that gives you back at about 1445. Do you see how that works? So the scripture tells us this 480-year period. But not just there. In the book of Judges, chapter 11, verse 26, in Judges 11:26, Jephthah is a judge. And remember how we said this is Jordan over here, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. You guys are Israel, you guys are the Mediterranean Sea. Jephthah's over here fighting with the Ammonites. And he's telling the Ammonites, he's arguing with the Ammonites, and he says, hey man, my family has owned this property for 300 years. Now, does that tell you anything? He says, my family has owned this territory for 300 years. When did that territory get acquired? Under Moses. And he says, and when does Jephthah live? Jephthah is about 1100 BC. So if Jephthah says, my family has owned this for 300 years, and it's 1100 BC, what date does that put you back to? 300 plus 1100 puts you back to the 1440. Okay, so these two scripture verses seem to support this early date then. And so that's a good thing. Now, the Merneptah stele. First of all, what's a stele? What's a tombstone look like? A tombstone is a rock, right? It's usually about 6 inches thick or so, a rock, kind of rounded corners about this high. A stele looks like a tombstone, only they stand about this high. And what happens is they're made out of rock. The ones I'm seeing, I'm thinking about Sarabit al-Khatam now, that the ones we saw were about this tall, they're about this thick, made out of rock, and on the rock, do they carve stuff in the rock? I am the great, Pharaoh of Egypt, and everybody bow down and kiss my feet kind of stuff. Okay, so they carve this stuff on the front of this and on the back of them, sometimes on the sides of them, and these are called steles then, and they learn to read, then you learn how to read these steles, and they tell you stuff, and they're carved into the rock. On one of the steles from Merneptah, it says, and we know the date of Merneptah is about 1200 BC, it says that Israel, the nation of Israel, is settled in the land. If Israel is settled in the land at 1200, then they must have entered it before then, right? So the 1445 date fits well with that Israel is settled in the land at 1200, they came in at 1400, and then they've had time to settle down. Okay, so that's the Merneptah stele in support of this. And then lastly, are the Amarna letters. These letters are really neat letters. They're written in Akkadian. And, the Amarna letters, what are these? Right in here is Jerusalem, okay? Jerusalem. The Jebusite or the Canaanite guy of Jerusalem, who's king of Jerusalem, writes to Pharaoh, and we actually have copies of these letters. These letters date from 1400 BC. And Abdi Keba of Jerusalem writes to the Egyptian Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, how come you won't help us? I've been asking you for help. This group called the Habiru, These Habiru are swarming us, and they're overpowering us, and we need some of your help, Pharaoh. Why won't you help? I've written you before, but you're not helping me, and these Habiru are coming in all over the place. Now, what does that sound a little bit like? Yeah, Habiru sounds like Hebrew. And in the past, some scholars have made the association that the Habiru were the Hebrews. Don't do that. That's incorrect. The Habiru was a much bigger group than the Hebrews. But is it possible that while there are Habiru all the way over in Mesopotamia, that the group of Habiru is very big? Is it possible the Hebrews were a type of Habiru, and the Habirus were pictured as more like gypsies that moved from place to place, and that they were coming in now as these kind of wanderers wandering in and taking over the land. And the king of Jerusalem is asking Pharaoh for help. Why won't Pharaoh help him? Is it possible the Pharaoh just got his tail whooped on the Exodus and saying, I'm not messing with those Jews anymore? You know? And so it seems to fit, these Amarna letters seem to fit this 1400 date. These dates date from 1400. So this is why I would probably hold this early date. Now, some of my good friends hold to what's called the late date, and they have the privilege of being wrong if they want. No, actually, they may be right, and I may be wrong. Okay, this is one of those questions where I'm not sure. I think I'm right, but I can see a lot of why they say what they say. The late date dates from about 1260. 1260. So you have the early date and the late date. This big argument. Now, first and strongest of their arguments, they say in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, it says that the Israelites built two cities, one called Python and one called Ramses. One called Python, one called Ramses. The city of Ramses was probably built in whose honor? Ramses, okay. Ramses II, who is the big Ramses, dates from about 1200. So if they built a city to this guy, Ramses, by the way, does anybody remember the 10 Commandments? Have you ever seen the 10 Commandments and the Pharaoh and the 10 Commandments with the bald head and stuff? His name was, does anybody remember that? Yul Brynner? Does anybody remember? Okay. Anyways, there's Yul Brynner plays the bald Pharaoh and things. He plays Ramses. So in the 10 Commandments, in the movie The 10 Commandments, which date did they take? The late date or the early date? They took the late date and they make Ramses the Pharaoh. By the way, does the Bible ever tell us the name of the Pharaoh? Never does, okay? And actually that fits with early records, because in the early records before 1000 BC, they didn't usually name the Pharaoh. After that period, they call him Pharaoh Necho or whatever. So Ramses is here. Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 says they built a city in honor of Ramses, and so therefore the 1200 date. Burn levels at Lachish. Burn levels at Lachish. What are burn levels? Okay, first we're going to do a little archaeology, okay? All right, so you're from Gordon College, you're going to go and you're going to work on Ashkelon with the guys from Wheaton, and you're going to go dig a tell. First of all, what's a tell? Yes, sir?
A tell is a mound of several cities.
Okay. Layered one on top of the other, okay? It's a mound, it's a city mound. Actually, exactly what he said, layered cities on top of cities. It's like a layer cake. It's like a layer cake. Now, by the way, where are you? Let me use Jericho for an example. Okay, first of all, if you're going to build a city in the ancient world, what's the first thing you need? Okay, and it's one of the most important things. You've got to have water. Question, are you going to build a city in the desert? No. Are you going to build it by a spring or a well? You're going to, all the cities, springs or well, you got to have water. Okay. Now, once you have water, let's do Jericho. Jericho's got this huge spring, huge at Jericho. Your city starts out on ground level. You build a wall around your city, and then where do you put your trash? In the recycle bin, and they take it out. Okay, now we're talking 8000 BC. Where do you put your trash? The people throw their trash, kind of like Massachusetts. They just throw the trash on the street, right? Okay, and so what happens? They throw the trash in the street. By the way, does sand get blown in to the city? And so all of a sudden, the city has a tendency to do what? Trash, more trash. And does a city build up? And so in the Tell of Jericho, it started flat on the ground, but by the time it gets done, it's 75 feet high now. Now, 75 feet high, and is it layer on layer on layer of cities, okay, of different ages, by the way. Now, let's be archaeologists. You're standing on the top of the 75-foot mound. What do you want to do? I can dig it. You want to dig it, okay? So what you do is you basically get a 10 by 10 foot square, and you take this 10 by 10 foot square, and then what do you need? You need slaves. So you go to Gordon College, other colleges, and you say, wouldn't you like to be archaeologists and you can really, study archaeology? So you go over there and they turn you into slaves. You end up digging this 10 by 10 foot square. And my thing is, they'll give you a toothbrush, man, to dig this stuff with this toothbrush. Why do they want you to use a toothbrush? They don't want you to break anything, and does everything have to be recorded as you move down through the stratus? You have to record every little thing, take pictures, et cetera, okay? All right, so now you're digging down this 10-foot thing. You get down a ways, and then can you tell the color of dirt? Dirt has a certain color to it. All of a sudden, you get to a certain layer, and the dirt turns all black and soot. And okay, so you got a 6-inch, I'm thinking about Jericho, you got a 6-inch layer of soot there. What do you think immediately? Well, I think actually the guy had a wood stove and it got out of hand, he burned his house down. Okay, so now we got, okay, is it possible the guy burned his house down here? Here. Now suppose we start digging over there, and when we get to the same layer, we hit this soot layer. By the way, will soot stain the soil? Soot, by the way, you guys ever, will soot stain your clothes? It will stain the soil. We get down to a certain layer and boom, we got another 6-inch soot layer. We got a soot layer here and a soot layer here. Now what conclusion do I come to? The city was burned down, okay, at that layer. So this is what's called a burn layer, and this is what's called a tell. Do you see what a tell, T-E-L-L? A tell is a mound, and then the archaeologists dig down. By the way, the more they dig down, does it get older or younger? The older you get down, you dig down, and then you try to date things with carbon-14 dating, with pottery dating, with material remains dating. You try to date things at each level as you dig down. And what they found is that there's burn layers, that the city of Lachish was burned about 1200 BC. There's burn layers actually at several cities in Palestine around 1200 BC, which would mean then that is it possible that did Joshua come in and smoke several cities, burn them down? So some people suggest that this is Joshua burning things down about 1200 BC, which would fit then this 1200 date. Do you see how that argument goes? Okay, so these tells and things, archaeologists, by the way, archaeology is really a wonderful thing, but is it hot and dry, and it's a lot of work and stuff. Why you want to go to Ashkelon is there's a beach right next door in the Mediterranean Sea, about 50 yards away. That's the place to go. You just have to dodge some Arab missiles, but other than that, you're all right. Okay, so there. Now, here's another reason. The Bible says 480 years before Solomon. 480 years before Solomon. How do they get rid of this 480? What they suggest is that a generation is 40 years. 40 years for a generation times what gets you 480? Is anybody a math major here? 40 years, 480 years. How many generations of 40 years does it take to get there? Yes, okay, 12 generations. Now I ask you, how many years between you and your parents? Is it usually 40 years? Now you say, well, your generation may be, because parents, but do you know for your grandparents, did some of your grandparents get married when they were like 18 years of age? My mother had me when she was 19. If my daughters came to me, anyways, let's not even think about that. Okay. Let me not get into that. But anyways, okay. So what I'm saying is there really a generation, is it really 40 years or is it more like 20 years between generations? It's more like 20 years. So if you take it as 20 years, what does that do to that 480 number? It cuts it in half. And so what they're suggesting is that this is 12 generations of 40 is the way that the scheme was, but an actual generation is 20. So therefore it really was 240 years and not the full 480 years. That's how they shrink that number. Hannah?
Would people around Solomon's time have to dream up that conception that it was 40 years apart?
Yeah.
I can't imagine that people were doing, having children as late as they do now back then.
Yeah. In other words, 40 years is kind of like how many years was Moses in the wilderness? 40 years. Yeah. And things that 40-year time period may have been just a kind of a standard measurement kind of thing. And so they tagged that onto the generation thing. So it's 12 generations back, you say, how long is generations? 40 years, was the standard measure kind of thing. And so then they may have done that. These people who are suggesting this shrinkage here, it's conjectural, okay? We don't know that, but it's conjectural. It does make some sense. It does make some sense because the generation is shorter. Yes, ma'am?
Wasn't there a calendar to measure these different things as well?
Yes. Their calendar was off some. They did lunar calendars and different things, but it wasn't that far off, what I'm saying? This is like hundreds of years off. So that calendar, we'll use that actually when some of the feasts and some of the other things, we can use the different calendars, and that will help us some. But when we got 480 years going to 240, that doesn't get us there. But save that argument. That's an excellent argument. We'll use that later on. Okay. So, early date, late date, question. Date questions to the book of Exodus. Is this really boring stuff? Yes, it is. Okay, so we'll get on. Okay, but is this a big debate in the book of Exodus on whether it was 1400 to 1200? Big debate, and there's people on both sides of this, and so I don't propose this.